Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's TPC training webinar entitled The Benefits of Mobile Forms for Your Environmental Health and Safety Programs. Today we have an expert in environmental health and safety going to talk to you. But before we get started, I'd like to give everyone just a little bit of instructions and a little bit of run through on what we're going to be able to offer for you after this webinar is over. So for those of you who are wondering whether the slides will be available from this presentation, absolutely they will be. We'll be sending these out in PDF format to all the attendees of this webinar after the completion of the webinar within 2 business days. So look out for that. The second thing I wanted to make sure all of you here are aware of is that you can interact with us and our expert here on the session by going to the lower part of your screen on the toolbar for Zoom and seeing that you'll have a chat bar or a chat window that you can open. And when you go into the chat box, you can type in your message or your questions, and we're super happy to take your questions and interact with you throughout the session, or more toward the end of the session after our presentation is over. I'll be collecting all those questions and answers for our expert here, and we'll be able to go through them. Just a quick note to make sure that you're sending those messages to all panelists and instead of all the attendees, or else all the people on the call will also get your question. So that being said, feel free to interact, feel free to send us questions, and also look out for the recording of this webinar, the audio recording, as well as the PDF of these slides after the webinar is completed. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our expert here. His name is Paul Colangelo. He comes with over 30 years of environmental health and safety expertise with TPC training. So without further ado, here's Paul.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you all for being on today's webinar. We are going to be discussing mobile forms today, but I think the central theme of this presentation, it's going to be very helpful to understand how documentation plays such a key element with an environmental health and safety program. 2 of the things that keep me very busy in my day-to-day work, I help companies establish environmental health and safety programs. And the other thing I tend to do is audit what they currently have. And sometimes, depending on the size of the company, the geographic footprint that the company has, it does make a lot of sense to take a look at technology and see if technology can give that program a boost. So we're going to take a look at today's session agenda. And I am going to typically speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. At least that's what I have it slated for. And again, we're gonna talk a little bit about the evolution of safety and health programs, EHS programs, how documentation and those applications are so key to these programs. It does tend to be one of those areas that is frequently overlooked or just not well maintained when it comes to environmental safety and health program. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the technology integration benefits and considerations. So you may be a company that has been using perhaps a paper-based system for a while, and you've considered integrating some technology, taking a look at certain vendors that market these products. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview on that. Not going to go too invasive into too many areas, but and then at the end, as Ryan mentioned, we're going to save some time for some Q&A. So without further ado, I do want to give a quick shout out to my friends at OSHA. Today is actually, we're right in the middle of Safe and Sound Week. I don't know if any of you that are on the line are participating in this initiative. OSHA did come out with the Safe and Sound Week initiative a few years ago. It's a rather new initiative. But the interesting thing about it from a timing perspective, it does focus heavily on a lot of the elements of safety and health programs and how documentation is woven into it. So even though we're kind of right in the middle of Safe and Sound Week, please, by all means, I've left a link here on the presentation that you can go to obtain the presentation, and you can click on the link and see if you have any interest in your organization participating in Safe and Sound Week, and you can earn some certificates for that as well. I've been part of the Safe and Sound initiative now since its inception, and it's a great program, so I would definitely encourage all of you on the line to explore that a little further. Okay, so environmental health and safety programs. Safety and health programs, you're going to see a lot of lingo here, a lot of acronyms, SHP, health and safety programs, HASPs. For those of you who are located on the West Coast, you're probably familiar with the term, the acronyms IIPP and I2P2, Injury and Illness Prevention Programs. Typically, these all basically mean the same thing. And what we are basically talking about is a documented program. It's usually, more typically, a documented program. And what it's basically documenting is how you go about, from an employer standpoint, making sure that how you operate safely, how you protect your employees when it comes to safety and health hazards, how you treat your contractors and subcontractors, within this program. It's basically the talk the talk and walk the walk type of a program whenever you're talking about safety and health. OSHA had a big initiative from the federal standpoint for years on how they wanted to make these mandatory. They've never been actually able to do that from the federal standpoint. But I do want to point out, depending on the state that you live in, certain states have made safety and health programs mandatory. You're also going to see this a lot contractually, depending on whether you are a manufacturer, whether you work in the world of construction or specialized trades. A lot of times when you get involved in certain contracts, it's mandated right within that contractual language that your company has to have a documented safety and health program. So again, some of you may be on the line with very sophisticated programs. Some of you may just be getting into exploring safety and health programs. Some of you may have had a safety and health program for a while. You're just interested in seeing, how you can make this more effective and robust. So this is some of the things I want to talk about during the presentation, but just please be aware there is a line drawn between what you want to do as a company versus what some of the states have already mandated that you have to have in place for this. I have left a link here as well that you can look at that talks about, it actually talks about all the states that have requirements for safety and health programs and talks a little bit more about what some of those requirements are from the certain elements of what those programs need to be comprised of. And I left a bullet here on this slide talking about safety and health program is not just employee training. Some of the things that do come up when I talk to employers about safety and health programs, there's a lot of confusion there as to what the safety and health program is and isn't. And it seems that over the years, a lot of folks have gotten accustomed to thinking that the program is just based on the amount of completion certificates that they could show someone as it relates to employee training. Employee training is certainly a big part of a safety and health program, but it is not a safety and health program. So just wanted to make mention of that. There does tend to be a lot of confusion when it comes to training versus an overall program. And I think it's helpful to explain something else as well. Within a safety and health program or a HASP, EHS, whatever you want to call it, within that program, you can also have individual programs that do talk about your training, that do talk about certain elements like confined space and fall protection. As we all know, depending on the type of businesses that we're all in, there are some categories of hazards that are so great it does almost force you to take a look at developing an individual program within the overall program. So again, employer-based safety and health programs can be very generic, very basic, and they can be very robust in terms of your day-to-day operations. Now, typically, when we are looking at this from an industry perspective, from a basic industry perspective, a lot of people tend to migrate to what OSHA has done in the world of safety and health programs. Again, I've left some links here, and I was just joking with Ryan before the presentation. I typically do not like to click on links during a webinar because sometimes you just never know what's going to happen. Even in rehearsal, sometimes these things take you to where you need to go. Sometimes, for whatever reason, you click on it and that little scroll feature comes up and you wait 5 minutes before you get to the landing page. So for that reason, I just typically don't like to click on the links. But by all means, again, when you do get the presentation, I would encourage you to explore these. I have posted a link for OSHA's recommended practices for safety and health programs. It's a very helpful tool, especially if you don't have a safety and health program currently, or maybe you're even looking to measure up your program against what OSHA recommends. There are 7 core elements that I am going to cover in the next few slides that OSHA does recommend that is part of your safety and health program. More of you on the line, especially those of you who operate more so in the environmental space, maybe a lot of you deal with a lot of program elements like highly toxic chemicals, things of that nature. We're talking about quality environmental compliance. The experts I look to for that, that is the ISO 45001. There is a huge push for the ISO 45001 occupational health and safety management systems. A lot of certification programs. These are more of the robust type of systems that are out there. And especially when you're talking about international compliance, the ISO 45001 is something I would highly encourage you to take a look at if you haven't done so already. And the last bullet I have left here is a comparison chart. This is a very helpful comparison chart that OSHA has put out once again, and I believe they have picked 6 or 7, and the ISO 45000 is one of them. They have picked 6 or 7 of these programs, and they have actually done cross comparisons on what some of those components are. So again, it's a very comprehensive and robust type of comparison chart that, again, if you're looking to kind of measure up your program against what certain industry, whether it's national and international key features are, I highly encourage you to look at that last link as well. Very beneficial in terms of what your program should be inclusive of. So if you click on that recommended practices link that I have included on the previous slide, OSHA is talking about 7 core elements of any safety and health program. Anything you typically look at, depending where it's coming from, you are usually going to see either all or some of these included. And as I was mentioning when I first kicked this off is, as you can see, education and training is certainly a core element, but it is not solely comprised of a total safety and health program. But most of these are very key features of any program: management, leadership, worker participation, any type of hazard ID and assessment, prevention control, and of course, as you are looking down toward the end of the list, management of contractors and staffed employees. That tends to be a very overlooked area of safety and health program. People usually go out of their way to establish an effective safety and health program for their company, but for some reason they seem to draw a line on their contractors, subcontractors, and staffed folks. And by all means, any effective program should encompass and include those folks. I mean, they are the lifeblood of your reputation if you don't self-perform a lot of what you do. So by all means, always include those folks in your overall safety and health program. Where we're heading with this is documentation is key and central for all these elements. Whenever you talk about any of these 7 core elements, documentation is certainly going to be required, whether it's from a historical perspective or a leading perspective. Those of you on the phone who are safety and health practitioners and professionals, I know you have heard lagging and leading indicator lingo before. Whenever we're talking about lagging indicators, and documentation plays a huge role in that, we're talking about historical data that we are using to take a look at how you've done historically. These can be things like EMR rates, experience modification rates, as it applies to your workers' comp rates, OSHA recordable rates. Again, historical data. What sort of injury and illness track record do you have? Leading indicators. This is where we're looking more so. how do you establish an overall training program? What does that look like? What does that documentation look like? How often do you conduct training? How often do you conduct leadership training with your management? What types of safety meetings that you do and how you document them? So these are things that, not from a historical perspective. This is how we look at your day-to-day leading initiatives that you employ within your company from a safety and health perspective. But it's important to know that documentation plays a big role in both a lagging and leading indicator standpoint. So now we're going to talk a little bit about program documentation and those applications. And again, this keeps me very busy in my day-to-day roles. I look at documentation all the time, or I try to help employers establish a documentation timeline. But as we all know, documentation, I don't care how you're doing it. I don't care if it's a paper-based system. I don't care if you're using, Excel spreadsheets, some sort of electronic record keeping, or you've got, more of a robust type of technology solution. Things can go south really quickly if you don't have the right people actively managing these systems. So some of the questions that I typically have for employers when I go in and I talk to them about documentation, first and foremost, are you actually using and practicing document control? You're going to have a very hard time explaining to me about the effectivity of your safety and health program if you can't show me documentation. Like the old adage, if it's not documented, it typically didn't happen. Well, that goes a long way in the world of safety and health programs, especially if someone from the regulatory side or the legal side is asking for these documents. So, it's one thing to fly a banner on your website talking about how safe a company you are, safety is job one. That all sounds great. What I need to know is what you're actually doing from an application standpoint and how you document all these core elements that we just talked about a minute ago within a safety and health program. Second question, obviously, is what format are your forms and documents in? Again, I don't want to knock anybody's process and system. A lot of employers, if you're still on a paper-based system and it's working for you and you've got the proper training in place for your management, they know what to do and how to do it, how to access these forms. You've got a very good documentation file keeping system. By all means, if it's working for you, fantastic. Some of you, you may have file cabinets that look like that. I know I come across this stuff all the time. We have no idea from an established history and timeline who's been keeping records, how many fingers have touched it throughout the years. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it within compliance? There's so many questions that come up about this. There can be a monster hiding in these cabinets. It can be very easy to think that just because you keep records, that those records are correct and they're compliant. And until you actually start auditing and you start evaluating your documentation on a routine basis, don't wait for something to happen to where you are asked to come up with this documentation to either find out you don't have it or you've got a total mess on your hands. So this kind of goes right into an established timeline and history of documentation. Again, some people are just starting off. They're not familiar with the record keeping systems. You may not have the benefit of having a safety and health practitioner or professional on your staff. You may have asked somebody from operations or human resources, to keep track of this. And, unfortunately, those folks are just having a very hard time understanding what's been done and understanding what they're going to need to do, going forward. This also kind of segues right into the next bullet about administrative oversight and ownership. I find that is typically the weakest link when it comes to documentation, regardless of the format. I think if anything, anytime you want to go about your documentation for your company, you have to make sure that your administrators are capable of doing that job. I think even from a technology standpoint, whenever people employ technology to help with these systems, they're of the opinion that these systems are just, they're just going to automatically populate and create what's needed. You still have to have a very effective administrative oversight on these systems and ownership. You know, sometimes people have a single point of contact for any sort of documentation. I tend to find that committee members, when it comes to this, whether it's a safety and health representative, somebody from operations, somebody from HR, because you're going to find that a lot of these documents are very common to all of these groups, and they're very common to the overall cause of safety and health program documentation. So it could be a little dicey having one person just in charge of all this. So I think you want to make sure that you've got some redundancy there on, ownership of the documentation, administrative control, and things of that nature. Next big question that always comes up is how accessible are the documents? You know, do you have a way to quickly get to this documentation if need be? You know, again, I just mentioned if there's an OSHA violation pending, if there's a legal issue that's come in, or maybe you have a general contractor that's asking for this documentation and there's a multi-million-dollar contract pending, you want to make sure you have this documentation accessible. The other side of accessibility is, can you produce what they are looking for? If I were to ask you to, come up with your last 3 years of OSHA record keeping, like your OSHA 300 logs, that may be an easy thing to do. But if I'm actually interested in knowing, let's just say, how many of your employees have undergone fall protection training in the last 5 years and what that training curriculum looks like, you may have a heck of a hard time going in and trying to actually pull those records out and hand that off to the person who's asking. So reporting, the ability to pull kind of custom reports, this comes into the accessibility. Of course, the other issue of accessibility is who are these records accessible to? As we all know, when it comes to things like medical records, you don't want these records accessible to everyone. There could be a lot of secure information in there when it comes to your safety and health program that you just don't want lying out in the open. So you got to be very mindful of that when it comes to accessibility. Next thing I always take a look at is standardization of forms. I know we can all take a look at what we've been using historically and think, well, that used to work in the beginning, and we really haven't revisited this. Some people, get standardized forms and templates that they use. Some people actually create these forms in-house. Some can download them right from the internet. Some people just ask, start with a clean sheet of paper and, if it comes to an injury, just write out what you need to. Standardization, I think, is very important when it comes to documentation. We want to make sure that your employees, your managers, your leaders within your company understand what forms need to be used. Are they in compliance with federal and state requirements? So let's just be very careful about what we're going to use when it comes to documentation. And last but not least, the ultimate question, is your documentation process audit worthy? Again, let's not wait till the last minute to find this out. If you are auditing your safety and health program, as you should be doing at least annually, you want to make sure your documentation is in line with that. So again, from an audit-worthy standpoint, all you need to do is ask yourself those key questions. If somebody is asking tomorrow or 5 minutes from now for these certain things, am I able to produce that? Are any of my regional offices able to produce that? Or my regional office is going to be able to sync up to what we all need to be doing from a centralized location standpoint? So a lot of questions come up when it comes to overall program documentation. Now, this list I have created on the next slide. As we know, there can be endless amounts of documentation used with environmental safety and health programs. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but these are some of the more popular areas where documentation is required. So anytime we're talking about field audits and inspections, certainly needs to be documented. Hazard mitigation, these are some of the things that we're going to do proactively. Site safety plans, anytime you're going to kick off a project, whether you're in the construction environment, in the manufacturing environment, these are some of the things that need to be documented. I did mention how other departments within your organization do have an effect on the overall EHS program. So a lot of human resource onboarding that's done that does require safety and health knowledge. Those are all things that obviously need documentation and historical data associated with it. Medical records, again, these are things that are very sensitive. You just don't want those things hanging out there for everybody to see, but you obviously need to make sure that you are documenting these for anybody that has exposure to toxic materials and substances. Employee training and orientations, OSHA record-keeping requirements. When we're talking about that, we're talking about your OSHA 300 logs, your summaries, your first reports of injuries. You may be working with your insurance carriers and brokers on any workers' comp and EMR related issues, so they may need to be in the loop on any time a piece of documentation is generated. And of course, any sort of your program enforcement. These could be things like, violation history or individual training requirements once a violation has occurred within your program. So again, there's a lot of different types of documentation requirements when it comes to your program. And again, getting back to the size employer you are, this may be very basic and it could be very robust. But typically, this is what you are going to see when it comes to program documents and those applications. Now, as we start to get into a little bit about technology integration, some of you on the line may have already pulled the trigger on that. You've already, gone out and you have employed some of this technology within your organization. Some of you may be considering this. What we're basically talking about here are workforce management software companies. Now, there's a lot of people that do play in this space. You can go out there and plug in those three words, and you're going to come back with a lot of the players in this. Some of you that already may be using like a learning management system. I think of companies like SharePoint. They're very big into this space. A lot of you may have those bells and whistles on some of your programs now, or you're looking at third-party vendors to help you out with workforce management software. But typically, these companies, if you look at those next 5 bullets, mobile forms, EHS compliance, incident management, employee training and orientation, and contractor management, some of these systems will do it all and more. Some of these systems may just handle a few of these components. But these typically are what you are going to see within a workforce management software program. And again, there are a lot of players in this space. Some of these players started off doing custom software programs for companies, and they just kind of evolved throughout the years. And some of them cater to a much broader audience, depending on what type of industry that you play in, whether it's manufacturing or transportation or construction. So again, you really got to do your homework when it comes to some of these vendors. You got to make sure that what they are actually out there offering is a good tailored fit for your organization. So let me talk about some of these components within technology on an individual basis. So if we take a look at the first one, which is mobile forms, which is just so happens to be the focus for our presentation today. I mentioned earlier about standardization of documents. One of the big benefits about mobile forms within technology is these standardized templates. It's kind of plug and play information. A lot of what you see within these workforce management software programs, a lot of these documents have already been created within the program, and it really alleviates the problem of either creating the documentation or implementing this documentation on what you're already using. So this is really nice to have when it comes to the portability aspect of it, where you can use this out in the field on a tablet, desktops and laptops at the office. Portability also means importability and exportability. Again, very, very simple and streamlined for the organization and levels of management to get a hold of some of this documentation that's going around. So again, whenever we're talking about that type of a workflow, we look at automated transfer and document lifestyle when it comes to document lifecycle when it comes to projects. So let's just let's just think to ourselves for a minute. Whenever you initiate a project, now I work in the world of construction a lot, and I know how these projects start from the estimating process right through the approval process to the implementation process. There's a lot of triggers in there for documentation. So whenever I see estimators go out there, we want to make sure that they are including safety and health questions in their estimating. Whenever that gets handed off to an award process and your company is awarded, now you're talking about perhaps a project manager or a lead to go out there and do an actual site safety plan. That may also trigger the need from somebody from the EHS department to approve that program. So think about all those points where typically those documents need to be created and handed off. Sometimes that handoff just doesn't occur with a paper-based system. This is a great way to make sure that a lot of those documents are triggered to not only be populated, but also go to the next level of someone for an approval. And then the system can actually say, okay, this document has basically made its way through the life cycle, and now we are ready to make sure we implement folks out in the field and get that project actually kicked off. And then, of course, beyond that, it can have future alarm triggers for routine auditing and evaluations, things of that nature. So there's a lot of great things that go into mobile form technology. The other nice thing is the use of photos and videos. This is a nice way to make sure that those photos and videos are attached to those documents, as opposed to just keeping these things in some sort of documentation process within maybe your intranet that you're using. Some people have access to that, some people don't. It's very nice to make sure that these photos and videos that obviously are worth 1,000 words make their way into these documents, especially when it comes to training, auditing, things of that nature. Incident management is actually a very important feature of this technology. Now we're talking about things like auto notification. I just described that in the previous screen. What's nice about this is you can actually set your own chain management points within the system. So anytime you're looking at project management, you can call out certain people, their emails, their phone numbers, on where that documentation is going to eventually go to for review and approval. There may be other entities outside of your company, such as insurance providers, other third-party administrators that you would like included in this process. So say that the contract is asking for certain insurance information. You may want to make sure that your insurance provider is within that loop, so people can actually get included in that process of life cycle with the paperwork. So again, very effective on how auto notification management works within these systems. Incident regulation feedback, another very helpful feature within the system, where if the audit or say a violation has been occurred, the system has a way that can automatically trigger whether this, maybe an injury occurred where you're wondering, is this an actual OSHA reportable or recordable incident? The system can actually nurse that along on how far you have to go with it by asking key questions about what has happened, taking you into some of the OSHA regulatory requirements or Department of Transportation or Environmental Protection Agency documentation. Things like, is a drug test required? Sometimes certain companies have policies in place where if an injury or incident has occurred, does this trigger the automatic need for a drug test? So, as I'm describing this, folks, think about what an auditor looks at. It's not just about tracking things like how how those injuries have occurred, and have you actually documented them. How about how you actually went about with corrective action? What are you doing to make sure that those things do not occur again? So again, software can be very helpful in those trigger points in explaining what you need to be doing in taking a look at some of those corrective actions on how to make sure that these things don't happen again, or at least lessen and minimize the possibility of those happening. So right in line with incident management, incident and near miss reporting, again, you want to make sure this is as streamlined and efficient as possible. You don't want to make sure that you are tasking on demand when something happens and it's all different. you want to make sure you have a standardized process in place. You want to make sure that it is easy for the employees and contractors to use. Folks, I have often seen that if you're making this too complicated for people, they're either not going to do it or you're going to end up with incomplete documentation. I don't know about you, but whenever I am looking for information about an injury that has occurred, nothing drives me more crazy than when I see either a document that has not been filled out or a document that has been half filled out. You know, and sometimes, again, you can't blame the person filling it out. If you've made it too complicated for them to do, they're just going to go cold on it and they're not going to give you the information. And then, you know, you're going to spend half your time on the phone trying to track this information down. So whenever you've got a software program that is making this more efficient for you, that's a big benefit for everyone. I talked about notification of process tasks, where you're not only looking at corrective, but preventative review and approval actions by chain management. There are a lot of tasks within the process that, you know, just have to be in place. And, you know, again, these folks need to know that there is a document, there is a safety plan, there is a program element that's not going to move to the next level without their review and approval. So again, very important to make sure that these people are included in this process, and obviously that they are trained on this to make sure that their review and approval on these systems is imperative. And of course, reporting and analytics, this is huge, okay? A lot of these systems have very sophisticated dashboards where the incidents and the KPIs that you're looking for. Whenever I talk about key performance indicators, I'm talking about, you know, metrics that measure what you're doing. It's one thing to actually look at injuries and illnesses. It's one thing to look at training certificates and completions. It's another thing to look at, you know, how you treat your contractors and what some of those vetting systems are. But when you're talking to management about the overall effectiveness of your program, this is where sophisticated software can actually create spreadsheets, can create pie charts on did you actually meet your goals? What percentage of those goals did you meet? You know, where are some of those gaps? So this is very, very helpful in helping you understand not only is this software doing its job within your day-to-day activities, but from an evaluation standpoint and an auditing standpoint, where you actually have to start focusing on where you need to be doing a better job. And this is actually a very big benefit of some of these software programs in helping you understand where those key performance indicators come into such a big play when it comes to measuring and grading your overall program. Employee training and orientation, another area where, again, is what you're doing now working? You know, how effective are your training programs? Do you implement technology into your training? You know, how effective is it to call people in from the field and sit them down in a classroom, you know, whether it's for a day or, you know, a week? And don't get me wrong, there's always going to be a way, there's always going to be an effective need for in-person classroom training, but there's so much more you can do with software. You can implement e-learning and online programs. Virtual reality for instructors is huge. Using your tablets for things like in the field toolbox talks that are already pre-programmed within the systems. Some people take a look at their homegrown programs, their organic programs they've maybe done on PowerPoint throughout the years. Well, you don't have to do away with those. You can actually import those programs right into the software, where you can actually establish a database of company content that's accessible. So, you know, if you want to pre-program certain training programs for your employees and contractors, there's a way that you can access these. You can categorize these within a library. So a lot of these programs, a lot of these providers of workforce management, they can actually create custom content. They have very sophisticated video production, where if you're looking to, say, you want a 15-minute overview on electrical safety within a troubleshooting process of an HVAC system, you can actually go to these companies and they can create some of this custom video for you. So it's not just about what's available to you currently, or what you want to do organically. These are some of the more sophisticated processes where you can go to third-party training providers, import what they have, go to these workforce management companies and have them create custom orientations and training programs for you. Tracking of certificates, that's another big issue. It's one thing to say that your employees have had training. It's another to produce the certificates in a very efficient time frame if somebody's asking. I gave that example earlier about asking about what sort of fall protection or confined space or scaffold training that your employees have had over a 5-year period. Something that's become very, very important too is actually looking at the curriculums. Again, it's one thing to say your employees or your contractors are trained. The very next question is, what does that curriculum look like? Is it current? Is it relevant? Is it compliant? We don't know where some of these training programs have come from. Technology can be very huge in helping you establish some of those compliance requirements. So, very important that you look at that, especially when it comes to running custom training reports. Again, is what you're doing now, are you able to do some of these things? I think if you were to have to start providing people with custom training reports on a paper-based system, you're talking about a very, very labor-intensive process. And at the end of it, who knows how effective it's going to be. Contractor management, and by the way, my apologies if that photo looks a little fuzzy. It seemed like it was clearer earlier, but contractor management is another big part of technology. If you think of companies like IS Networld, these are the folks that actually look at the pre-qualifying metrics of certain companies. As I mentioned, your contractors and your subcontractors are the lifeblood of your reputation. So if you don't self-perform a lot of work and you're relying on them, it is very important that you include them in the environmental health and safety program of your company. Not just to take a look at what they have for a program, but making sure these folks are included in the process. We're all part of one family here. Whenever we're doing work, whether it's in a manufacturing facility or a construction environment, you want to make sure everybody's included in this. So it's very important not just to conduct pre-qualifying. It's also to make sure that you are doing due diligence on things like safety and health orientations, site safety plans, making sure, again, they have a trigger mechanism within their hierarchy of management to make sure that they're reviewing documentation as it's generated and as it needs to be generated. This technology is very helpful in generating security and safety photo ID cards for subcontractors and contractors. Let's just say from an employer standpoint, you have generated a mandatory 30-minute orientation of your company or maybe one of your company's project sites, and you are going to make it a policy that every contractor and their subcontractors go through that orientation. That technology can actually trigger those within the process to make sure that these folks go through these programs and a certificate is generated and an on-site security and safety photo ID card is generated to those contractors and subcontractors as well. So again, depending on how small or how robust you use contractors and subcontractors, I think technology can be a very big help in establishing those requirements. If you are considering technology, again, some of you folks maybe have already employed this technology within your company, but some of you may be considering it. Just some of the things you may be wanting to ask yourself before you go about this. I would encourage you to look at your workforce. So when I talk about workforce dynamics, are you ready for technology implementation? If you have a younger workforce, if you have folks that learned on technology, a lot of the millennials and Generation Zers, unlike me and the generation, the Generation X category and the baby boomers, a lot of these folks learned on technology, so they may be very apt and ready for this technology. If you tend to have an older workforce, it's not that you want to rule out technology, just understand there's going to be a learning curve there. And you want to make sure that training comes along with that package. A lot of these providers can be very, very helpful in not just implementing this technology within your company, but they're kind of along for the ride in making sure that a lot of your workforce they aren't ready for this. They're going to establish a training and orientation period where it's going to be a lot easier for these folks to embrace this technology. I got to tell you, technology can be a very scary thing to an older worker. I've seen this firsthand, and I see it firsthand, week in and week out. We as safety professionals and practitioners have got to do a better job in making sure that whatever technology that we implement within our company, we're taking these considerations into our workforce dynamics and making sure that these folks are included in the process in this learning curve. As I said, you want to make sure that you have capable and assigned administrators. These folks can make or break your systems. I think a lot of the misconception about some of these processes and programs is that they're just kind of automated. They almost take the place of these folks. They don't. Like anything else within your environmental safety and health program, you have to have key people that are managing these systems. And anytime it comes to administrator access, whether it's just partial or overall, you want to make sure you've got a very solid team in place. And you want to also make sure these administrators understand what their requirements are. And again, I'm going to go back to the training providers and vendors. You want to make sure you ask these key questions. Can you help train and groom our administrators on these points? Because again, I take a look at a lot of these technology systems that people are already using, and I can tell when these things haven't been touched for months or even years. They just kind of tend to become a catch-all of misinformation or lack of information that's been put in there. And again, if you're going to spend the money on making sure this technology is employed within your company, make sure that you have capable administrators. And then, of course, people always take a look at, are they budgeted? What's the return on investment going to be on this technology? I certainly think from an efficiency standpoint, perhaps even a compliance standpoint, you're going to see a big return on investment. But I think that one of the things you need to take a look at, don't just assume that there's going to be a big outlay of funds right off the bat. A lot of these companies, they have a very efficient subscription-based product where some of it is based on, say, your workforce headcount. And don't quote me on this, but some of them may, a subscription base, they may say, okay, it's $5 a year per employee or $10 a year per employee. So this can be a very good way to get your foot in the door with technology without having to spend a lot of money right out of the gate. So don't just if you've considered technology in the past, don't just swear it off because you figure that your boss is just going to turn it down because there's going to be this big outlay of money that's going to be needed. So, these are all questions you want to ask a typical provider. And again, there are a lot of people that play in this space now. Some of them, again, they establish products specifically for a clientele or an industry. Some of them are a lot more broad in their offering. So, take a look at them. Make sure you vet them, and are they a good fit for your company? Is their system scalable? You folks have really got to think ahead on this. Where are you going to be in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? Is this product going to grow with your company, or are you going to be needing perhaps, third-party integration or different types of technology to support it? So I would encourage you to make sure that the system itself is scalable. Platform, again, whenever we're talking about platform integration, you may already have a learning management system. Is it going to be compatible with what you have? Is the company going to help you with integration, or are you going to be on your own to go out there and have to employ a third-party integrator to help you employ this process within your company? Is it going to be available on cross devices? Certain things that you use within your company, do they operate on different systems, whether it's iOS based versus Google based, Windows based? Does the system work both online and offline? That's really important when it comes to some of this technology. As we know, if you're working in very remote areas where you just don't have Wi-Fi or access to internet, it's very, very helpful that you can populate some of these documents while you're in offline, and as soon as you get back to internet connection, all this information is very easily uploaded to the system. So also another question that you may think about asking. And then, of course, the big support system, right? You want to make sure that whoever is you're engaging with for any of these products, do they have 24/7 support? Folks, technology, I wish I could say it's 100% perfected. As we all know, it's not. There are ghosts in the machine. There are glitches that do come up. Very, very important that your technology provider offers service after the sale. So those are just some of the questions that you want to ask, and perhaps a lot more. Taking a look at the clock, and I think I've just come up on where I need to be. So at this point, I hope this information has been helpful to you. I know that we probably have a lot of diversity on the phone from the size of companies. Some of you may be very well versed with this information. Some of you may be just starting off here, and maybe this has given you a little bit of insight on where you need to take your environmental health and safety program to the next level. I will encourage you that if you need any further assistance with a technology product, TPC can be very helpful with this. So I have left some contact information there on the presentation with an email address and a phone number. The folks here at TPC, great group of people on the phone that you can talk to for any questions and taking a look at what they have to offer to help you along with technology for your EHS programs. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Ryan and see if I can answer any questions for you. And if there happens to be any questions I cannot get to, I usually do a very good job of following up after the fact. You can leave your contact information, and I'll do my best to get your questions answered. So Ryan, I'm going to turn it back over to you at this point.
Thank you so much, Paul. I will reiterate what he said. You guys can always get in touch with us at this email, sales@tpctraining.com. That's kind of our central mailbox for any inquiries about anything that we do, in particular environmental health and safety programs for this webinar. Ask a question there, and we make sure to get an answer for you as soon as possible. Also, just chat with one of us by calling this number. So Paul, looks like people do not have questions this time, so you are all set to go. We will be catching up with all of you. I just want to make sure everyone is aware that we're going to have the recording, this audio recording with the screen share that you saw today, available on our website within 2 business days of this webinar's completion, as well as the PDF of these slides are going to be sent to all of you participants of this webinar as well. So thank you so much for being here, everyone, and have a wonderful day.